Hi, I'm Maria Lantin, an artist and technologist and director of the Basically Good Media Lab at Emily Carr University of Art and Design in Vancouver, Canada. I'll be presenting the Stonemaps paper today. Also on the Stonemaps team are Hanif Janmohamed, an artist and designer and CEO of Vanilla 5 Creative, Alex Haas, an artist and designer at Emily Carr, Harley Guo, a former, now graduated, congratulations, Master of Design student at Emily Carr, and Devon Gerard, a software engineer with Vanilla 5. Stonemaps is a framework to promote the formation of slow, intentional networks with characteristics of gifting, dialogue, and collaboration. Stone maps are common river stones imprinted with maps on their surface and embedded with an NFC chip. The NFC chip can be scanned by a mobile phone to open up a channel to the stone's virtual network. Networks are formed through the physical act of gifting. The stones travel from one person to another as a gift. Each recipient is invited to contribute to the intention of the network and asked to give the stone to another. The stones gather content from participants along the way. This contribution can be of any kind, and once gifted, it becomes part of the collective knowledge of the network. By introducing a physical stone as the mechanism for connection, Stonemaps deliberately slows the traditional notion of social media networks. The intent is to blend the best of physical and virtual interactions towards deeper, more meaningful conversations so we can create, solve, and investigate together. It's a kind of documented collective sentience, a network that can be deeply and reliably interrogated. This project started from a feeling of being awash in information and yet shallow in conversation. Current social networks give us the capacity to link to almost anyone, but are not yet structured for good conversation. A good conversation diverges and converges around a shared state. It creates trust and intimacy. It takes time, practice, and patience. Current social networks are optimized for quantity of content and time spent on the platform. What has become apparent on platforms like Facebook and Twitter is a descent into shallow, provocative, and often uncivil interactions. The big platforms are aware of the problems, but are hampered by a business model that is not aligned with the goal of good conversation. We take our cues from those that argue for slower media. The Slow Media Manifesto, inspired by the slow food movement, asks us to mind the means of production and consumption of media. Another guiding principle is that of the commons. The P2P Foundation describes it as the participatory creation and stewardship of common goods that are universally accessible. Productive citizens in communities creating shared resources. Taken together, these ways of structuring media aim to deepen engagement and produce collective, sustainable abundance of knowledge. The values that animate Stonemaps are in line with those of the Slow Media Manifesto and include intimacy, trust, dynamism, curiosity, generosity, creativity, responsibility, joy, collaboration, preciousness, intentionality, and the gift. We start with the humble stone as the material anchor for the Stonemaps network. A stone takes its time, measured in eons. Over millennia, a stone comes into itself and gains its identity. It warms from the heat of our hands and has a focused, weighty presence. A stone in hand is a reminder of the larger stone beneath our feet, the one we stand on and all share, and upon which our existence is so thinly spread, much like the patterns on these stones. Holding the stone reconnects us with the stewardship of what is underneath our feet. The smooth river stones are embellished with a map printed on their surface using a high-resolution transfer process. The maps can be of any desired location and scale. A small hole is drilled into the underside of the stone as part of the production, and in a final step, a small NFC tag is inserted into the enclosure. The stone can then be scanned by an NFC-enabled smartphone to access the virtual network. The stones travel as gifts, creating an intentional network as they change hands. Giving a stone to another person entrusts them with a shared intention, and it invites them to join a comment. The stones then are travelers on the waves of gifting, on the generosity of human curiosity. When the stone is scanned, it reveals a glimpse of its travels and asks the recipient to join the network. If the recipient accepts, the stone asks for an initial gift, a contribution towards its intention. During the Stonemaps gifting encounter, the gifter communicates the obligation inherent to the gift to the intended recipient. Not only is this transaction slow, but the contribution requested from the stone also demands focused attention. It is not a throwaway tweet or a picture, but rather a significant first introduction to the network and a serious engagement with the network's intention. There is likely to be a significant delay between being gifted the stone and gifting it to the next person, as the holder of the stone considers their first contribution. All of these layers of slowness around the ritual of the gift stress the importance of non-trivial engagement. The stone, however precious it may look and feel to the holder, cannot be kept as a possession. Gifts carry with them social obligations that strengthen communal bonds. If these obligations are fulfilled, the full richness of the gift becomes apparent, a dynamic, intimate group of actors committed to contributing to a varied and deep conversation for the benefit of the network. A stone travels along a path of weak ties that are strengthened over time. Weak ties represent connections made by individuals across strongly connected networks. For example, a person may know very well the person they are gifting the stone to and may have chosen them specifically for the network. But, especially over time, the existing members of the stone's network are likely to have a much more distant connection to the new member. The stones travel along these lines of connection, acting as bridging devices and encouraging diversity, a wider worldview, empathy, novelty, and innovation. Once the gift of the stone has been received and reciprocated, the former holder of the stone is now a full participant in the virtual network. This network functions in many of the same ways as the social media we are currently accustomed to. It has accounts, contributions, comments. However, it is founded on the principles of the commons. The members of the network are the creators and stewards of the content. The network is governed by its members, and its value accrues to them. The movement of the stone through gifting gives form to the network. The intention of the network is the mechanism by which it creates the value that is shared by its members. Here are 3 scenarios of stone intentions. In this scenario, the stone wants to travel to the inside of Fort Knox. The current holder of the stone has the responsibility of finding someone who can propel the stone to Fort Knox and to convince this person of the importance of this mission. As the stone travels towards Fort Knox, it asks for a picture of the location of exchange with a short story of why it may lead to the stone's desired destination. The existing members of the network have full access to the documentation of the stone's travels and can choose to remix and synthesize the contributions into a public travel log. In this scenario, the stone seeks to answer the question, how might we make Canada's post-COVID reality truly green? Each new recipient is briefed on the question by the stone gifter and can see the last answer given. They can choose to enhance or counter the previous answer or give a completely new answer. In all cases, they are urged to take as much time as they need. As the stone collects answers to the question, the existing network can deepen the inquiry by conversing on the different contributions, perhaps adding references and creating a summary. The network is ultimately responsible for declaring the inquiry finished and setting a new intention for the stone. In this case, the stone's next intention is to find someone who can deliver the synopsis of the inquiry to Justin Trudeau. In this scenario, the stone aims to complete a 5-pointed star within a circle in a specific geographical location. When the stone reaches a specific point, instructions are given to collect the hidden treasures in the vicinity and reach the next destination. When the last point on the circle is reached by the stone, the secret is unlocked and the network is fully revealed, ready for its next mission. These scenarios can be combined as sub-intentions to a greater intention. For example, if the network wants to start by talking to a sociologist before setting a question, it can set a sub-goal of finding a sociologist and once found, ask them for an opinion. In this way, the Stonemaps interface supports both exploration, going deeper with sub-inquiries, and synthesis, resolving pending inquiries. If two stones cross paths, they have the option of becoming an entangled pair. The exchange is a mutual gift, and the networks can choose to merge and share future intentions or to work collaboratively with distinct goals. Or they can choose to merely greet each other, mark the encounter, and continue as before. The stones for the Stonemaps network have been constructed and tested with various phones. An interface has been developed to create new stone designs based on custom map styles. The virtual network application is currently in development with UI design goals that support an informative public face to the network and its activities, an accessible interface to support the gifting exchange, and an enchanting, playful interface that reflects the group dynamics and keeps the stone moving. The application is multi-platform and supports familiar social media functions, such as user accounts and profiles, and adding content to the network, like posts and conversations. It adds mechanisms for synthesizing new content from existing content, so co-creation, communal decision-making, and management of common resources. The Stonemaps network can only be successful if the constituents know that they control the flow of information with those outside the network. It's important that they do not feel watched or manipulated in any way. So we're looking to decentralize solutions such as Oasis Labs and INRUP that preserve data integrity and give users control over what data gets shared and with whom. To be sustainable, Stonemaps needs to generate revenue to support the maintenance of the platform and the network's greater goals if these require revenue. This is likely to be achieved through many different means. The direct sale of stones will generate seed revenues to each network. Subscription models would further sustain the basic operation of the platform, and stone networks would be able to attract donations from their growing membership. The selling of users' demographic, geolocation, and behavioral data, typical of other social networks, has been amply proven as a lucrative business model. However, this model generally bypasses the data generators themselves. We are interested in evolving this practice to preserve the sovereignty of user data, provide transparency and consent regarding data usage, and reward users directly and commensurately through support of the platform and network initiatives. If the network generates a surplus of revenue, the members can choose to direct the funds towards external projects that they find valuable, or fund new projects spearheaded by its members. Stonemaps is a project that enters into the discourse about new models of social engagement that emphasize values of shared generated wisdom, what we have called collective sentience. It resists the push towards the enclosure of knowledge and interfaces that promote shallow engagement and invisible manipulation. Stonemaps are slow media. They traverse personal connections to create thoughtful networks built along invisible currents of affinity. Stonemaps is both a social experiment and a distributed art project, a media space that is deeply connected to the physical world through hand-to-hand connections.
Jane Bennett's Enchanting Materialism argues for aesthetics' role in engendering an attentiveness to the ecology of things that make up our world. Becoming aware, she claims, has the capacity to lead to an ethics of generosity. Responding to Bennett's call, this paper asks, how can sentience participate in an environmental politics? In what follows, we relate how twilight states and the edges of darkness emerge from a meshwork of materials to attend to sight, and recount how our encounter with familiar and emerging materials in creating spinning world. And our analysis focus on how material assemblages open up empathetic spaces. Twilight States was an interactive site-specific installation staged as part of Siteworks 2016 at the Bundanon Homestead. Bundanon is situated on the land of the Wadi Wadi people of the Yuin Nation and of the Dharawal country on the southeastern coast of Australia. Bundanon's Trust Siteworks invites artists, scientists, scholars, researchers and communities to participate in dialogues in its annual event. Twilight States was created for this particular site. The work consisted of 17 sets of interconnected pale pink, yellows and grey silk fabric mounted on bamboo embroidery hoops. Each set had an image of a single endangered floral species of New South Wales embroidered onto the fabric. The image is magically superimposed onto the landscape as if it was drawn into air. Circular microcontroller boards and electronic components were sewn onto the silk. The rambling circuits reminiscent of insect trails connected sensors and actuators to lithium polymer batteries charged by circular solar photovoltaic panels. During the day, the solar panels charged. When the light sensors on the fabric detected a foreign light, the microcontroller switched on the LEDs which blinked to pre-programmed patterns. In the light of day, Twilight States played to both the sense of touch and sight. Visitors reach out to feel the tactility of the hand-embroidered images and the trees on which they hung. The gentle breeze swayed the silk forms and compelled the picnickers to look up to make sense of the connection between the landscape and the ghostly orbs. Bennett refers to such sentient spaces as sites of enchantment, where encounters of genuine wonder with the natural environment can motivate ethical, ecological thinking. At twilight, between sunset and dusk, a magical half-light glows. In this temporal in-betweenness of wonder, Twilight States shifted in hue and intensity of form. The work pushed and pulled between appearance and disappearance, the familiar and the uncanny, to enable a fleeting experience for recalling connections of feelings rooted in time before they are forgotten. As vision faded, the translucent circle of silk gave way to points of luminescence amongst the trees. After nightfall, the frogs began to croak, and their rhythmic chorus convinced some viewers that the artwork's pre-programmed light patterns were intentionally synchronized with the local amphibian symphony. Other viewers became sentient of non-human presences in the nocturnal landscape. In landscapism, at the speed of light, darkness and illumination in motion, Tim Edensaw and Hayden Lorimer explore the embodied experience of darkness and illumination within landscape in participatory performative events. They explain that, quote, level of dark and light provoke affective and emotional responses, controlling bodies into movement, activating passion, charging the imagination, instigating sensual pleasures and discomforts, unquote. The darkness erases the spatial boundaries that allow somatic sensing to expand outwards. Senses other than sight respond to the nocturnal landscape that envelop the body. The enchantment of the winking LEDs in the darkness of the night drew the visitors deep into the terrain to come into contact with non-human entities. Bennett's call for micromaterialism of sensibility to be enacted through aesthetics echoes Edensaw's and Lorimer's use of the term landscapism to describe, quote, the transporting and enchanting effects that results from estranging the encounter with typology, terrain, and atmosphere, unquote. Art has the capacity to draw out the liveliness of things within spaces of enchantment imbued with the uncanny. Twilight States dramatized the site with artworks made from diverse materials that responded to environmental conditions, giving rise to the affective, emotional, and multisensory dimensions of Bundanon Homestead. Such experiences enable the human visitor to become a participant observer, a sentient being who simultaneously witnesses and feels the interconnected entities that constitute place. How then does sentience build an active environmental politics? In Vibrant Matter, Bennett proposes a materialist theory of democracy that de-anthropocentralizes Charles-Rancier's political theory to include non-human agencies. Bennett speculates that by conceiving ourselves as a conglomerate of living and non-living entities, the self-interest that guides our action may become more encompassing. In her view, this reframing allows for, quote, emergence of more ecological and more materially sustainable modes of production and consumption, unquote. To imagine how this materialist ecology performs political work, it is useful to acknowledge that agency does not necessitate intentionality. Bennett writes of how Bruno Latour conceives of a materialist politics. Quote, Latour frames political action not as the enactment of choices, but as the call and response between propositions. A proposition has no decisionistic power, but is a lending of weight, an incentive toward, a pressure in the direction of one trajectory of action rather than another. Yet any given response to a problem is less the result of deliberation than of fermentation of the various propositions and energies of the affected bodies, unquote. Central to the making of Twilight States was this call and response between propositions. Our account shows the combination of materials, textiles, electronics, trees, animals, daylight, twilight, and nightfall, as well as natural forces such as wind and rain, did not so much intentionally create a sentient experience as it lent weight to its emergence. In recognizing capacity of affect in non-human and non-living bodies, Bennett's vital materialism exposes the inadequacy of the nature-culture divide. She argues that by transforming, quote, the divide between speaking subjects and mute objects into a set of differential tendency and variable capacities, unquote, we can advance towards a more democratized way of thinking that is inclusive of ecologies of all entities.
We extended our mature explorations of Twilight States in the Visiting Research Fellowship at the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences in Sydney. We examined how traditional metallic thread embroidery techniques seen in the museum's Asian textile collection may offer new ways of creating e-textiles. We invited a materials scientist and a climate scientist to join our project with an aim to further investigate how we can combine natural and smart materials to make artworks using ecologically sustainable processes, but with reduced environmental footprints. We imagined other onto stories of our changing climate. We titled this onto story Spinning World, which took on a form of a mixed and multimedia installation at the Sydney's Powerhouse Museum, which received over 27,000 visitors. Spinning World consisted of 3 e-textile works. Central to the installation was a large hand-stenciled wall hanging, where gigantic and smaller corals filled a fantastical watery scene. Hand-embroidered speakers were camouflaged into their depictions of coral polyps, and when triggered by viewers' presence in the gallery, an underwater sound recording of the Great Barrier Reef could be heard. Another work featured a flock of fluttering white birds. It was a direct response to the late 19th century hand-embroidered green silk kimono from the museum's Asian collection. A third component presented 2 fabric swatches depicting enlarged microscope images of coral polyps. These were screen printed with touch-sensitive graphene. When the visitors touched these images, LEDs lit up mimicking bioluminescent patterns of ocean animals. In studying the green silk kimono, we observed how the design depicted a world within a world, energized by entities acting, reacting, and interacting. The birds embroidered in white silk swooped over a moss green seascape embellished by gold thread. We adapted this idea of a world within a world to construct an animated sentient space that inspires wonder and appreciation towards non-human ecosystems. To tell this onto story, a fabric-length hand stencil with shades of green color was animated with a flock of fluttering birds made out of white rice paper and hand-fashioned electromagnets. Bennett writes that, quote, animation can disturb as well as delight, as dead things come alive or objects reveal a secret capacity for self-propulsion, end quote. By setting a flock of birds in motion, the e-textile work enlivened and invoked the spirits of non-human entities latent within the cultural and material stories of a museum object. The large-scale wall hanging depicting a panoramic coral scene positioned on the central gallery wall beckoned viewers into the space. It was the paleoclimatologist's research of deriving long-range climate datasets from studying coral substrates that catalyzed the concept for this work. That is, corals as bioarchivists. These bioarchivists systematically collect and record the variation of ocean temperatures in the calcium carbonate bones up to 400 years. The green hues of the wall hanging invoked the vitality of environmental politics. The main protagonist, a coral, was reimagined as a gigantic entity occupying a seascape in the story. The entire scene was created by hand printing with manually cut stencils and eco-inks onto recycled cotton canvas. This slow-making method enacted an ecocentric approach that invokes a sense of care and attentiveness towards these creatures and their communities. In addition to sight, Spinning World activated a sentient space for the viewers through auditory and tactile senses. As viewers entered the space, their presence triggered a proximity sensor which signaled to the circuit to play an underwater sound recording of the Great Barrier Reef through 18 handmade speakers. These devices were made by couching silver wire coil and magnets onto fabric, which were then sewn onto the wall hanging. The soundscape emerged quietly from the textiles, enlivening the museum space, calling for viewers' attention. The noise, reminiscent of a sizzling frying pan, moved the audience closer to the artwork, lending an ear to the conversations and voices of the aquatic communities living in a healthy coral reef. The third component of Spinning World consisted of 2 e-textile swatches with graphene screen prints depicting enlarged microscopic images of coral polyps and capacitive touch circuits stitched onto the fabric. When the prints were touched, electric currents flowed from the soft circuit into the human body, depleting the electric charge stored in the graphene and triggered animated light patterns of bioluminescent plankton. Importantly, an eco-friendly formula for conductive graphene ink was developed for this project. The cycle of trials involved in synthesizing this material was guided by the, quote, call and response between propositions, unquote, that must negotiate between the use of environmentally sustainable solvents and optimization of the material's conductive properties. The application of this ecologically sustainable material in the artwork gave rise to an enchanting experience that mediated connections between human and non-human bodies and worlds.
Artworks as assemblages intensify human awareness of materials' vital propositions. telling of onto stories draw the audience into a material constellation with other non-human and non-living bodies, suspending the habitual anthropocentric thinking. The experience opens up a sentient dimension that is beyond the nature-culture divide. Onto storytelling here is an aesthetic intervention that moves the body to listen, to touch, to feel, to pay attention, and to take notice. Bennett describes, quote, the desire to make it possible to discern a kind of life irreducible to the activities of humans or gods as a material vitality that is me. It predates me. It exceeds me. It predates me, unquote. Twilight states and spinning world reimagine enchanted worlds that are us, but they also exceed us, predate us, and predate our material existence. To conclude, we borrow Bennett's statement on Walter Whitman's sympathy to claim that art too can, quote, help us discern more actively this tendency towards tending and to articulate a trans-individual model of receptivity, affectivity, and sociality, unquote. By appealing to sentience, we aim to activate a deep hope through art that can compel meaningful actions in sympathy with all bodies in an ecosophic world.
Hello, this is Reynaldo Thompson and Titham Copadiay at the University of Guanajuato in Mexico. And this time we are presenting the paper named Indigenous Sentience, Fernando Palma's Electronic Divinities. So please let me share the PowerPoint that that we have prepared for you. So here it is. Here you have it. So I will read some parts of the text, and then at the end, if you have some questions, please let us know. So the question of sentience we wish to explore in this paper have reference to the issues raised in the resume for the conference. The questions that Fernando Palma's installation referred to are similar to the issues that the conference proceedings at the ISEA 2020 directly addresses, namely, how is sentience investigated in indigenous media, arts, aesthetics, philosophy, humanities, and social sciences? Is there such a thing as a politics of sentience? Is this politics necessarily progressive? Could it be deceptive? What is the sentience relationship to power and knowledge? Palma's electronic installations, animated by Arduino technologies, remind us of a zoomorphic movement and its intrinsic mysteries. For Palma, the artifact is situated at the Nahuatl moment as a mythic object which simulates the sentience of the gods. This is where technology intersects, displaces, and reinstitutes global discourse of the arts. Palma looks at sentience for a Proto-Aztecan war angle. His electronic puppets exhibit reflects a moment. Let me move this from here. Exhibit reflects a moment as in biology's tissues, but also as if they were senses of conjuration or divine games. These moments, let me minimize this. These moments in Palma mythical snakes and horses demonstrate reflexes from the perspective of human desire and appear to be completely intransigent and whimsical, just as divinity is always whimsical and erratic, ultimately and full of the dark humor which it has always been throughout the history of civilization. Education and early work in Palma's trajectory. Educated in Mexico City, Amsterdam, and London, and intellectually conditioned by the spatial order in the European museums, Palma remained insulated in heart, like a son of the earth who defines categorization. There is a reason for this. Unlike Palma's postmodernist, unlike nativist, even Palma directly transcends frontiers. He lets his own indigenous imagination thrive in the context of the modern museum with the same dignity that the order never experiences. The same naval icon is placed in a synthetic conjunction with machines. This is a crucial point, the animistic moment in Palma's work. Palma's electronic puppets respond to a multidisciplinary multiplicity of variables. The snake or broken horses momentarily come back to life in the presence of a viewer. This is a whole new level of sentience that narrates the mystic dimension of the Aztecan imagination, just as it does for the other categories of imagination. Format and electronic, sorry. Well, this is a detail of the previous image that you have seen. This is a work from 1994, and well, it's an installation. Okay, now format of electronic manuscript. Palma's Coyote or Venus. In Palma, Quetzalcoatl, Venus star or Coyote are shamanic aspects of perception, godness, and evil, life eternal, and its counterpart, death. These dualities are held together in any critical assessment of Fernando Palma's synthetic vision, his fusion of genres in a post-minimalist, post-kinetic context with a general rival of identity and of fear and comedy in the audiovisual robots of his imagination. Educational and early work. Palma installations remain so enigmatic because of this embodied message that it emits. Palma himself does not expressly believe in relationality to be existing in his work. This is a detail of the same artwork. Palma himself does not expressly believe in relationality to be existing in his work, yet a fine relationality brings together parts of his sculptures. This does not seem at first to be a context in which he was doing art in the 19th, especially in London and elsewhere. The 19th represent the coming of an age of the artist. Palma, as we know, had studied in Mexico City, but his initiation into electronic art came about in London. Palma's grooming in London in his years as an artist was decidedly defined by relational art. What relationality generates is a confluence through reconfiguration of pre-existing elements rather than pure subjective expressions. Relations are also assemblies, not just semiotic, but objective, as Palma demonstrates in the installation of the late 19th in London, especially exhibitions which he curated. Palma shared this accidental conformity of relationalism with colleagues he had been working. Palma's affiliation with artists like Miwa Koyama and Takuro Mikame at the 19A Gallery in London shows that even in his early work, where he was yet to composite a distinctively indigenous motif, he was venting through a style built by the entire post-Fluxus generation and Nicolas Vauriot. Later works. If we take a deeper look at Palma's immediately later works, we see this transformed Palma. Consider his greater, more recent work, Soldado of 2001, Los Nahuales of 2017, Tetzawil of 2018, Tlatuique Xipetotec in 2019, Tetzawil of 2019 as well. What most he sees to create is that sentience of the gods that define and make and remake Aztecan culture, his entire worldview, which assumes a suprasentient consciousness as a level of origin for this visible world. Indeed, this process is evident in all his work exhibited on both sides of the Atlantic at the MoMA PS1 in 2018 and the Gaga Gallery in Los Angeles in the same year. The MoMA exhibition with Palma called it In Ixtlit in Yolol, that is Nahuatl, with the people, and his more recent retrospective at the Museum of Art in Oaxaca. This is Nahuatl again, Gesli Gu Myung Tolawan, or land. First, the content. Palma, as the MoMA exhibition demonstrates, represents at its finest, we believe, the program body of the otherwise invisible, visible plumed serpent. Here, even in the middle of the Anglo-centric war, the majestic serpent revives itself with its staccato movement, with what Andrea Scott calls lo-fi architecture, the beautifully insinuating spiritual memory of the Aztec deity. Quetzalcoatl is a super deity described not only in the sculpture of the Teotihuacan, but described in all its color with the Codex Telleriano Remenesis, now retained at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. In Los Angeles exhibition, the notion of Venus associated with Quetzalcoatl, but often as the cyclical serpent being achieved furious and comic brilliance in the installation about which Palma himself writes, Mexico, I quote Fernando Palma, Mexico as the land where we live and with the atmosphere of fear and turbulence, which according to our ancestors was generated at the time when Venus entered the phase of appearing in heaven, is embodied here. Evening, however, is a form of creation that is the manifestation of the force that in our eyes is dark. In the complex web of life, it is a time of change and rebirth, end of quote. This appears in the blur to the exhibition at the Gaga titled Tlohuacan Mictlantecutli Chaquén Can. This was now and held between 29 and October and the 14th of January of 2018. As in typical problem sculpture, Palma utilizes kinetic stepper motor to make body parts or organs which are functional but are not full-fledged in movement. They appear restricted by a process which in relation to such architecture has been called low fidelity structure. Low fidelity has a specific purpose in Palma's work, which is of course none other than the paradox of creation of comedy. Palma's repeatedly drawn attention to the comedy and hope adjacent to the kinetic sculptures, the process invisible in the coyotes, which are deific aspects of the soul. This is also this theme in the representation of the Nahuales, especially in the Oaxaca installation at the Museum of Art in Oaxaca. The brilliant and focused use of the DC motor is a hallmark of Palma's kinetic art. The amount of deliberately berated control given to the machines expose the technological depth of Palma's art, specifically in the use of such low intensity motor to evoke controlled comic movements. As a conclusion, we can say that the idea of technological indigeneity should thus be imminent, especially in the context of a need for diverse phenomenological and more spiritual understanding on human behavior. It is not less than a progressive desire for novel and avant-garde sensations in contiguous element of experience. Indigenous sentience also draws its sap from roots of culture and long embedded conditioning. The quest for a technological indigeneity, which carries the symbolical objects of communities and people on its back, is one way in which diversity could be retained for a future, which is divided by identities. The possibilities are immense for a post-human indigenous culture to emerge. Technological indigeneity posits a corrective to that vision and sends a signal of diversity, color, instrumentation, and notions of form which are independent, different, and autonomous in their trajectory. They demonstrate that spaces and museums can inspire pathways. This is true of Palma's deeply rooted imagination. This is evident in his installations as archetypes that take an expected technological form in his works. In case of Fernando Palma's technology affiliates with the Aztec imagination, especially the figure of the plumed serpent Quetzalcoatl, the serpent of eternal life and death, and the coyote operative, a robotic projection of the artist himself, on his soul with its nahual candor and feeling. Palma is not outward, but inwardly oriented for a museum. But the instruments are all there, owned and inserted in place as a part of technological continuum and the service of indigenous mind. Finally, indigenous art, not art per se, are not arts per se. There is hardly any decorative end for indigenous expressions, since the creative expressions follows upon sacred belief and is aligned to guardian's spirit. The question of art itself is derogatory and flippant, if not frivolous, for the shamanic view of things. This protocol is, however, not strictly retained in the New World. but indigeneity continues to live in the in the contemplative mind, even beyond the contemporary formats of formative visual or solid art for galleries or home possessions. Technological indigeneity takes a step further backward with its phenomenological message and comedy, all mingled together in a living and transforming unit. Thank you so much for listening.
Presentation session 4, the ECOSOPHIC World Expanded Encounters. My name is Cynthia Noury, and over the next 45 minutes or so, we'll be discussing with our guest researchers and artists, Maria Lantin, Hanif Janmohamed, Alex Haas, Jola, and Reynaldo Thompson. So very glad to have you with us today across all time zones. So as I mentioned on the chat, I'll be monitoring the questions during the discussion. So just feel free to jump in with any questions or comments. I'll try to integrate as much as I can in this conversation. And you can also get in touch with the panelists after the presentation through their profiles on ISEA's website and continue the conversation over there. So in order to get started, I'll do a quick recap and introduction of our panelists. Since they have long, extensive, interesting CVs, we'll keep it short for the sake of time. So the first presentation we have seen was about Stonemaps, a slow intentional network for collective sentience powered by beautiful river stones and gifts to the network added by the participants. We have many people from their team today, starting with Maria Lantin, director at Basically Good Media Lab at Emily Carr University of Art and Design, Alex Haas, who is a lecturer at Emily Carr, as well as multidisciplinary artist and designer, and Hanif Janmohamed, president of the creative company Vanilla 5. Welcome to the three of you. That's today. Next, we discovered Twilight States and Spinning World, two superb e-textile installations for an ECOSOPHIC world created by Jola and Agnieszka Golda, who are both artists, researchers, and lecturer at the Wollongong University in Australia. And Joe is with us in the middle of the night to discuss the work. Welcome. And finally, we are joined by Professor Reynaldo Thompson, who reflected on Indigenous Sentience in the electronic divinities of artist Fernando Palma Rodriguez. And there's already reaction in the chats of people really enjoying his work. So Reynaldo is attached to the University of Guanajuato in Mexico. So I'll start by asking you a common question, so don't hesitate to discuss and add up. We'll start by addressing the topic of the panel, why not? So the ECOSOPHIC World Expanded Encounters. You've all discussed that already in your presentation, but you certainly have more to say about it. I'd be curious to know how you would say your respective project help us approach encounters differently, including through an ECOSOPHIC perspective. So how are you reinventing our perception of encounters through your work? So I'll let anybody jump in first. Maybe we can start with the Stonemaps team.
Well, I can say something about. I don't. Oh, Hanif, you're muted if you want to start. I mean, basically the idea is that with the gifting encounter, right away, it's a very somewhat uncomfortable proposition, right? So you're approached maybe by a stranger, maybe by a friend, and you're being told to join in to a discussion. And that's situated in the world, right? And often if the intention is about, say, learning more about where you live, it can be very situated, right? So maybe the question is about, how healthy is the shore, the paper with the tapestry and talking about the coral reef, right? So maybe you're meeting on the shore and you're talking about the coral reef. and the intention is to figure out, you know, how do we make it better. So I think encounters in the world force a different kind of discussion as opposed to the ones that we have online on Twitter and Facebook and so on.
So bringing the stone brings this element and connects us back to what is outside the screen.
Yeah, I think that part is kind of interesting, the abstraction that we live with in the context of virtual world as opposed to the physical, and I think that bridge is kind of what Stonemaps plays with.
Awesome. Joe, would you like to add anything on that? Because that's really, your installations are heavily focused on this idea of creating new encounters for people engaging with them.
Yeah, what brought us together. Agnieszka's a textile artist working with installation. I work a lot with screens and electronics. But what really kind of we gravitate towards is the idea of materials, and how artists, the first thing you do is to encounter the materials, and the materials tell you a lot. And sometimes it's very much not intellectual, it's very much about feel and touch. If the fabric's not going to do what you want it to do, you won't do it. If the graphene is not going to conduct enough electricity, it's not going to do it. So you've got to work with the material. So that's the first level encounter with the material. And as we develop our work, we look at where the materials come from, how it was made, you know, and how that relates to environment. So that's one side of, you know, where we're coming from. Then working with environment, situating, first of all, in twilight state, situating it that is in a piece of land that has been cleared, has largely been colonized, but also sort of getting, I suppose you have to get close to the environment to sense that's what's happening in that environment where you're going to put an intervention in the first place. Like we talked about in the paper, how there are other things that, you know, we can't control, with what the frogs are doing, what the crickets are doing, you know, what the other life forms in there. And in Spinning World, working with climate scientists, and actually started thinking about the environment, materials in the environment in a different way, about any of the coral for that project. And the piece, so we kind of bring coral through the visualization, which is a kind of an abstraction, the coral through the images, the microscopic image of the polyps, and also bring touch to that as well. Seem to, that particularly with the graphene work with the touch, that connection, even though you're not touching coral, it moves the audience in a different way than just looking or listening. So I guess there's number of different layers of bringing that ecosophic world or connection encounters with, for audience to the natural environment through materials of making, through the context of the environment.
Thank you very much. And Reynaldo, I guess your connection with Fernando Palma's work was strong enough, your encounter, that you decided to work on it. How did you receive his work from your hand? I'm sorry, I can't hear you right now. Yeah, go ahead.
Now can you hear me very well? Can you hear me?
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yes, I went to Oaxaca, a state that is in the south of Mexico, well, south of Mexico City. And I went to a museum, as I almost all the time do. And there was this exhibition, and I really liked the artworks that there were. And so then I started talking to my colleague, Tirtha, and I said, well, you know, I think we have to study this artist because his artwork is just amazing. And then he started looking into the internet, of course, as we do now, and to check his production. And we realized that he is a really interesting artist that is not very well known here in Mexico. So, well, because he was living in Europe for many years, especially in London and Holland. So he said, well, I think we have to contact Fernando. And then we were able to contact Fernando, and we realized that he's such an interesting artist because he doesn't only make artworks. He's very into ecological issues. Actually, he's in a way he lives in Milpa Alta. Milpa is a kind of the way pre-Hispanic people planted the fields. I mean, they planted corn, beans, and citrouille. I don't remember the word in English. And so there are like a tree.
Pumpkin?
Pumpkin, exactly. Thank you so much. Pumpkin. So pumpkin, beans, and milk, and corn. So those were the three plants that they planted because actually they extract. I mean, they provide some elements for the other plants. So it's like a very interesting way to planting the land. And so Fernando was in a way trying to promote with. I mean, not only him but also his family in this place called Milpa Alta. They have promoted a way of coming back to, in a way, this way of planting the land. And we realized that he's such an interesting character because he also, well, he speaks Nahuatl that not many people here in Mexico does. So he speaks Nahuatl. He knows a lot of history on the natives of that region. And well, it also, in a way, he's very sad because Mexico City is absorbing all these pristine places before. They were pristine before, and now is the more and more you see houses being built in his neighborhood. So he's in a way very ecological, and in his artwork he tries to use some recycled material. Many of the times they are old machines, like the sewing machine that we saw it. It's an old machine. I mean, he doesn't go to the store to buy new ones. He tries to recycle many of his pieces. And all the time he's tried to bring back this culture that actually is rooted in the place where he lives now, that is south of Mexico City, in the neighborhood of Milpa Alta. So yeah, was that by accident, but a very happy accident that I discovered his work.
Yeah. Very interesting. Thank you. And we've got questions that are starting to come up from the people watching us. So comments first for the Stonemaps team. There's Cecilia, who said it reminded her of a tradition in the Andes in Peru called apacheras. I don't know, does that ring a bell to your team? So maybe you can
tell us about it.
Well, the chat will have to tell us about it, or
Yeah.
maybe you'll have to get in touch with Cecilia afterwards. Also, a great question about the collective aspect of Fernando Palma's work that could be extended to your other work afterwards. So there's Mauricio, who's asking, Reynaldo, considering that expressive practices in indigenous communities are relational and collective, aren't these artwork you showed indicating a Western lens to indigenous culture? And I guess it comes from the fact that they're maybe signed by himself rather than collectively. That's what I'm inferring from his question.
Right. Can you please reformulate the question, because
I'll read it again. It's harder when we don't get to talk to the people, but he's saying, considering that the expressive practices in indigenous communities are relational and collective, aren't these artworks you showed indicating a Western lens to an indigenous culture?
Yeah, I see. I understand. Well, in a way, of course, it is Fernando who signs the artworks, and it is also his name on the exhibitions, not of the community where he lives or where he makes his work. Yeah, in a way, well, of course, it's a contradiction, but I think in a sense, art is pretty much well, it used to be very individual at some point, but there are also a lot of contributions. And sometimes the artists recognize the contribution of others. I mean, especially now in electronic art, that there are engineers and scientists and many other people working together with the artists. They normally recognize presently the work of their colleagues that are not artists. In the case of Fernando, I think, well, Fernando himself, his formation primarily is, he's an engineer. He studied engineering in Mexico. And then when he moved to Europe, he started studying art. First, he studied art history in Amsterdam. And then he moved to London, and he continued studying art. So, in a sense, his practice is he's in a way collecting information from the people that lives in the neighborhood or in the place where he presently lives. But also he's a very cultivated person. He knows a lot of history and a lot of not the official history that we know, mostly in Mexico, but the history of the pre-Hispanics. So how they live, how they work, on all these issues. So yeah, it's in a sense it's contradictory, the fact that he works this idea of the collective, but also in a sense his science, the artwork that of course belongs to him.
And there's also a very interesting collective element to the Stonemaps project. On the one side, we talk a lot about the rocks and the rocks' intentions. There are many of them, but each rock has a path. But then it's also a collective experiment and network. So how do you balance those aspects and kind of view the community at the art of your at the center of your project?
Well, I think we see the networks as kind of self-regulating, and the model we looked at was the mushrooms and the mycelium, and we have this idea of a self-regulating, self-generating network.
Would anyone in the team like to add up?
Yeah, I think that one of the things, there's obviously a very individual component in the sense of, during the encounter, you are asked to give your thoughts about the intention of the network. But as you get into the virtual network, as you yourself pass on the stone, there becomes this idea of the synthesis, right? So when you think about platforms like Twitter and Facebook, they generate a lot of chatter, and chatter is important, and you can get sort of the zeitgeist of what's going on. Mike Pence's fly, for example, like, that became the topic for a good 2 or 3 days. So you get the impression of what's happening, but you don't get a synthesis of any of the chatter. And so, people take the data from Twitter, analyze it, and create graphs and, write papers on it. But what if you have an intentional network that is actually about going deeper? So you take the chatter of the network, and then you work together to synthesize knowledge and create something that can be presented as deeper, as sort of a wisdom, right?
And I'll insert one of the questions from the chat, again from Cecilia. She's asking, is there any tradition on which you've based yourself to choose stones as the main element for building up the network?
I wouldn't say it's a particular tradition. The notion of the stones came out of a recognition of this dissociation between a geographic sense of place and a physical sense of place. And the question came up was, well, why not? How would you relate the two? How do we come outside of an abstracted life that we live in our heads, in our virtual world, and represent it physically? So the idea of taking a map, which is an abstraction of place, and putting it on a stone, which is a physical manifestation of place, seems kind of interesting.
Definitely. And there's another question coming from Mauricio, and it's about your work, Joe, with Agnieszka. And he's asking, how are spectators able to realize the interactive components of the installation, for example, the touch interface? And also, how have the spectators' meaning interpretation been related to your intentions? So maybe I'll rephrase.
Yeah.
So first one, how do people get to find out about the interactive component? Yeah. And do you see that people are kind of getting the same interpretation as what you meant?
Yeah. In the Spinning World exhibition, we're lucky to have that in the Museum of Applied Art and Sciences, which meant that audience do, and especially children, do come in and expect to be able to touch everything. So we didn't have to prompt them. And the touch interface was so used, the graphene was so touched that we have to replace them twice. They just,
wow.
And so on the table, because we were guided by the curator, there was panels there to let them know what they are. But they do, generally people just, it's probably a museum context, it's probably because of artwork in the museum context that when you're allowed to touch, people tend to like really welcome that. And when it was exhibited in a different venue, you do have to tell people that you can touch it, because often people are so well trained not to touch anything. But just to bring back to the discussion about collective, that's quite interesting with the Stonemaps and, you know, and that kind of contributing relational aspects of art making. This is also something that we recognise, having done Twilight State Spinning World, that at times when I was doing some maintenance work, I've observed audience, you know, how they interact with the work, which was great. And one time I was telling a little girl who didn't know where I was and asked me what the whole big wall hanging was, and I said, you lean closer, you can hear. And she was really excited, and you know, and then she told her sister, and I think we wish that we could have recorded that kind of audience interaction a bit more, so that we can actually do a little bit more of that reception study. So in our current project, we have extended that into creating workshops for the community. So our next exhibition will have workshops where people can actually make those stickers, they can actually use the graphene for screen printing, and you know, and make some sort of animated birds or something like that. So we want to bring that material, that closeness, back to the public who experiencing. So we have recognized there's a gap between when you actually exhibit something in the museum and your intentions and how the audience are actually receiving that. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, and what about when you're in the fields with your installation? Is the relationship with them different?
With the first work, it was a one-day event, so we did stake out all day, just watching people, what they were doing, and it, again, like just having the diverse public is really great, not specific art audience. And we saw when we had the hoops that was up in the trees, and people were intrigued, as you saw in some of the footage, but kids like to kind of jump up and touch them like basketball, you know, like sort of, you know, not so much hitting the ball to them, but you know, playing with them. So there's a lot of that kind of interaction, and it did attract attention. So that was, so that was really observing what they're doing, but we would like to bring the community and enhance that kind of connection. But my comment on the stone map, I imagine that with the stones, I'm quite curious where they come from, and also I imagine they must be so nice to hold that probably hard for people to let go of.
For sure, I think that that's part of the tension. You know, they're very beautiful, very poetic objects. But you know, the notion that you create this bond through the gift is puts a lot of tension on, you know, holding it or giving it away.
And how have people, I guess I'd be curious to know more where you're at in this project. Have many people tested the network? And how did we react to this idea of like the rocks intention? Like how is the rocks intention built in the first place, and how do people react to it?
Maria, why don't you jump into that?
It's a right now it's mostly not built, right? So we've just tested it in terms of like hypothetical situations, and we've just actually we're submitting a grant right now to the CMF, and that particular project is really going to concentrate on getting to know the land and its history and geography. And being in Vancouver, and well, you would know too, in Canada in general, there's so much of the history that has been lost or not talked about. So, you know, it's about reintroducing that, but it's also about reintroducing you know, what Hanif was talking about, like the difference between knowing the city and knowing the land. So, you know, it's easy to say, oh yeah, I know Vancouver, someone asked me direction, I can totally, you know, orient them through the landmarks. But if you ask me about the plants that live there, you know, why this particular plant is living on the shore, and is this an invasive species, and what does it mean to be an invasive species, and all of that, you know, what else lives, not just in the sort of human realm. So these are the kinds of intentions that we want to start with, and we want to, one of the things that is not easy, and something that Joe pointed out was, you know, how do you motivate this handing of the stone to the next person? So, you know, trying to introduce the human element in it, so that there might be a stone guide that is actually giving you information and, you know, sort of a very personal dialogue about your context, so that there is a personal motivation to give it away, so that, you know, you will only get more knowledge if you actually get the stone moving on.
Mm-hmm. And when are you planning on launching the network to a wider audience?
Well, our first intention is to do a pilot test here in Vancouver, where we'll learn a lot more about user behavior and intentions and how that works. And then sometime next year, with some funding, we'll look to a more, you know, a larger kind of launch.
And there's Matthew here asking a more technical question. He's asking, are the rocks self-augmented in any way, like with an NFC tag? So you mentioned that there was one in your presentation, or is all the tracking strictly through the app? So
yeah, the stones have an NFC tag, which yeah, attaches, you know, it works with the smartphone, and then we take the GPS location from the smartphone.
Perfect. Thank you very much. One theme that was really interesting and kind of going through all your presentation was around this idea of like the politics of sentience. The question is asked very clearly in your work, Joe, with Agnieszka, where you ask, how can sentience participate in an environmental politics, for instance? So, I mean, what reflection points as your work brought on that topic? How can we use sentience in like a positive means for society and our relation with ecology or indigenous culture, for instance, or connection?
I think in the end is about paying attention. Is really, and it has something when Maria's talking about the knowing Vancouver, and it kind of also, the stone reminds me of in Japan, there's a habit of when people go for a walk and they find a space that they particularly find magical, or maybe a god lives there, they will stack up the stone, a little stone stack, sort of, and it's kind of a similar thing of paying attention. just taking the time. So with spinning world coral, and it's kind of almost like, well, yes, of course, corals are bioarchives, but you point that out, what our hope is for people to find out more about it. So how, so we are focusing on trees as well, and how that becomes a tool, archivist that might tell scientists what weather was like in the past. That's paleoclimatologists we're working with. It is about pointing out, and by paying attention and getting knowledge, thing that contributes to kind of that you are acting with knowledge in participating in the politics.
Awesome. Who would like to add up or Reynaldo, how do you see artists such like Fernando or other art initiative kind of increasing our awareness of like indigenous culture, sentience, or recognition?
Well, actually, there is a sort of movement here. Many artists are dealing with these issues of environment. Actually, Fernando is one of them, but also, I don't know if you have heard of Gilberto Esparza. He's also very much into environmental issues. He was the winner of some very important prize in Ars Electronica, probably 3 or 4 years ago, probably a little more, 4 years or so. And he was using the served waters to produce energy in an exhibition. So he did that project. It was called Plantas Autofotosintéticas. And that was a project that he developed in Lima, in Peru. So actually, there are pretty much a lot of artists working on that direction. Fernando Palma is one of them, and yeah, I have recorded some of the works of other artists that actually, for me, those are like the most interesting projects that I have seen recently. Of course, there are plenty of other works, but I'm pretty much into ecological issues as well. So yeah, I think the idea of going back to ancient cultures, that they have far more respect of the environment that we have now in a capitalist society. So I think that's probably the only direction that we have to take now in the arts and in many other fields, not only in the arts.
Yeah, and in this technology tension between technology and nature is especially present when it has to do with social networks and increasing farm servers and chips in our computers. So how do you approach that with the Stonemaps project?
Well, it's kind of like the new Neolithic. You know, it's a bit of a game as well to bring the natural into the synthetic.
I mean, I think there's none of it's clean, you know. I think there, especially when you talk about, I don't know if we talked about in the paper about blockchain, is going to be one of the technologies used for Stonemaps, and blockchain is known to be like sucking energy out of the system. But having said that, there are very smart researchers trying to decrease that energy required. So in general, having a distributed architecture might be a good thing. You know, none of it's clean. Yeah, I was super impressed with the tapestry work actually for that, that it really, you know, that it tried to minimize its impact. As soon as we go to networking technologies, it gets muddy.
Yeah, and you had a question for relating that project, if you want to ask Joe directly.
Yeah, it was about the speakers, and it seemed, well, it was beautiful, and they seemed hand sewn, and you know, I was wondering about the volume of the sound and also the dynamic range of the sound that you can be achieved with.
Very low, very low. You have to get quite close. Yeah, but you know, in terms of materials, the museum did think, you know, why is it so quiet? When this is not, you know, $5,000 speakers, they are handmade speakers. But we do trying to get the different materials, you know, to sew a piece of drafting film or some sort of paper so it vibrates a little bit more to kind of give it a bit more resonance. But in terms of materials as well, we are now moving into using recycled silver wire. So where we can, we're trying to source materials that's sustainable. And by introducing these materials in the workshop situations, we're hoping participants are aware that, you know, that there are these materials available, that we can make a choice in some of these materials. But, you know, it is always a way up. You know, we started using pea silk, which is when you don't kill the moth, but it's quite terrible to sew with. So you always, with the graphene as well, so instead of using organic solvent, our material science colleagues used vitamin C to develop it. But then you're always weighing up, you know, that you can make conduct graphene quite easily if you use a lot of these organic solvents that's quite damaging to the environment. If you actually choose an alternative, it's much harder, and it's also more expensive. So, but I think the intention to pay the attention to the materials and where they come from is a good starting point.
Great, thank you. Yeah. We've got roughly 10 minutes left, so if anybody listening to us has questions, please get them in. I've got one for Reynaldo, but first I was curious to know, Alex, we didn't get a chance to hear you much so far. What are, in your view, the most interesting aspect of your project that you'd like to share with us of Stonemaps?
Well, it's the area that we've been talking about, is how we could integrate this very slow network more precisely into the natural environment. And, you know, it's not a direction that we've had the opportunity to fully evolve yet, because, you know, we're still building it. But I really want to see how it could root, you know, a practice like this could root the recipients into this place to become more steward-like.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Does anyone want to jump on that?
One of the indigenous values that we are looking into is reciprocity. We're actually, Alex and I are part of a book club on the braiding sweetgrass, which is really pointing that out in very beautiful ways. And in fact, in that book, they talk about the three sisters, which Reynaldo talked about in his talk about, you know, how do you, there's three plants that you can plant together that really work well in agriculture, and that they call those the three sisters. But anyway, so that reciprocal relationship is not something that we tend to have definitely with technology, and it's everything that we have done, most everything that we have done with technology has been very colonial. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, even when you talk about augmented reality, and you can speak of Stonemaps as an augmented reality, it's been about just taking over the land for the purpose of a game. Pokemon Go is a very good example of that, where you're co-opting someone else's land for the purpose of the game and for the purpose of acquisition. And so how do you bring back this issue of reciprocity? So if you're out on the land with the technology, how are you giving back to that land? And it's actually really, really hard if you try to design for an experience like that. You keep falling back into this colonial model. It is capitalistic and transactional, we are born and bred into that system. And so it's been a very, very good experience to try not to do that, to really lean into the reciprocity angle.
Yeah, and what are kind of your strategies for trying not to fall back into those colonizing anthropocentric models? Because I guess like you're facing it with Stonemaps, but Joe, most certainly you're facing it too in your work. How do we get to decenter ourselves from the only perspective that we know, that of the human, really?
Well, one of the things that is coming up in a number of projects is basically the idea that you have to practice pushing yourself into a stewardship or giving back kind of mentality, a citizenship mentality, as opposed to a consumer mentality. And I think it's really an unlearning and a learning.
I suppose it's a very extended vision of what a citizenship is that could extend to like the non-human or other than human. And
yeah.
One of the influences on the project was the Kula rings, which is in the Trobriand Islands, this whole issue of reciprocity and the gift, these circles of gifts. So I think there are some very interesting things that come out of the gifting model that really speak to reciprocity and bonds and stewardship and all of those kinds of issues.
Joe, would you have like specific strategies in approaching your work and the experience you design for people?
Yeah, I think to start from the angle of making, again, I started with this idea of the materials that you just have to collaborate with the material. You can't force it to do what it can't do. So you've got to listen, you've got to pay attention, and then you've got to, so with Twilight States, we were on site about 3 times before we decided how we're going to, make the intervention into the space. And we do come with the quite romantic ideas. We think, oh, it's down in the country. It's a place called Bundanon, and it's very well-known Australian artist Arthur Boyd has gifted that land to the nation, but it is still, colonized land. So when Twilight State was actually part of an event that marked the 100th anniversary of settlement. So how do you bring that reconciliation with the Indigenous, not just people, but habitat? You actually find that the land itself is very much, the wood's been cleared, and, a lot of that happened. In fact, the fires we had early this summer have actually nearly went through that property, which is quite devastating down that land.
And we're heading to the end of the conversation, so maybe just in a minute, Reynaldo, I know there'd be much more to say on that, so maybe you can continue the conversation elsewhere. But there is Cecilia asking if you could just say a little bit more about the divinity-nature relationship in Indigenous Sentience, and I think it will complete very well what Joe just brought there.
Yeah, well, the idea of the divinity in pre-Hispanic cultures is something that you cannot collect in a way as we do with art. So the idea of connecting these two issues are like very important for the paper that we were trying to explore with the work of Fernando, because as we say at the very end of the document, is a kind of sacrilege to consider a piece of, a religious piece as an artwork. So something that we cannot, in a way, put an exhibition is something that is more sacred. Well, in a sense, now the divinities are like becoming artworks in museums rather than in temples or churches. So I think in a sense is the idea of rescuing all these background or these ancient cultures and to explore in a different, from a different perspective.
Different way. Thank you very much. I'm gonna have to stop you there. Thank you to all of you for participating, and also to the people that were listening to the conversation and brought very interesting question. So once again, I'm Cynthia Noury, and I was along researchers and artist Maria Lantin, Hanif Janmohamed, Alex Haas, Joe Law, and Reynaldo Thompson. So if you wish to keep the discussion going with them, feel free to reach them through their ISEA website profile, or send them an email. And for those of you staying online, the next session will be Matters Mattering, Collective Interactions and Play. So thank you very much to all of you, et bon symposium.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.